for something that's already been created, or can you get them to pay you for things that you're currently giving away because you thought that was just good customer service? Well, that's what happened with IBM. They started realizing that all this great consulting that they were giving away to sell hardware had value, and they should start charging for that value. And they've morphed over time under Lou Gerstner's leadership into more of an intellectual property company than they were before.
Yeah, you know, Andrew, and maybe either you could pull an example from your head, or just maybe even a client that you'd work with. But
Right.
you give us an example of a small firm. How do they identify this?
Right.
And then what would they, give us an example of something very simple that they may not be thinking about. I mean, we talked in general terms.
Right.
But
I'll give you a couple of examples. Okay. Number one is, again, maybe starting the process with kind of a strategic intellectual property audit, talking through some of the different types of intellectual property that you have. And also, and here's the key part, what are some of the applications or industries that your products might apply to that you're not selling into today? Because you're small, you're focused on your customer. Good example. We met with a small toy company. They made a special type of toy. They were doing pretty well, about 8 to 10 million in revenues. We looked at their patents strategically. They had a couple of patents. And we looked at the patents strategically and said, you know what? These patents have applications beyond toys. There's a mechanism that makes the toys attractive to kids, but that same mechanism could be used for all types of things. Retractable roofs could be used for military tents. Okay, this was in the middle of Desert Storm, and people, you saw these shots of, windstorms coming through the desert. These could have been lightweight military tents. Now, you're not going to take a toy company and turn them into a lightweight tent company. So what do? You find a government contractor in and around the Beltway that's already selling to the federal government, and you license with them, or you joint venture with them, or do a strategic alliance with them, or a distribution right. I mean, there's lots of intellectual property leveraging strategies that's available once you've identified the asset. But part of this process is trying to think outside the box and saying, where might what we're doing today have other industry applications, even if we're not going to pursue them for ourselves?
Okay. Back up a little bit. Okay. But there's, obviously there may be firms that they're identifying this stuff. Okay. Protecting it. I mean, what do you do to protect it? You need a specialist that, you need a lawyer because it's pretty complex.
But you need two people at the table, or one person that knows how to do both.
Right.
And that is a lawyer and a strategist. Because if I come into your office, to the typical lawyer, I'm not saying there aren't more progressive lawyers, but to the typical lawyer, they're going to be reactive. So you're the entrepreneur, and you'll say, here's my bucket of gold, tell me how to protect it. Most are not going to look inside that bucket and go, Karen, you've also got some platinum in here and some silver and some other things. Let's sort of spread all these riches out on the table and do some strategic planning around them. The strategist has to come in and see the opportunities, understand the applications, be working with counsel. For example, when you go to file your patent, you file a series of claims. The claims ultimately make up the guts of your patent. If those claims are drafted very narrowly, your patent is not very valuable and is not going to lend itself to the kind of intellectual property leveraging that we're talking about. If your claims can be drafted more broadly with some strategic vision attached to them, then there's a much better chance that it will lend itself to licensing opportunities down the road. And I'll tell you what my pet peeve is. My pet peeve is an entrepreneur comes along, takes their last $50,000 and spends it on a patent, gets a patent from the U.S. Trademark Office, which they get beautifully framed and bound to put up on their wall, only to come to find out that the patent's claims are very, very narrow. And they take it to venture capitalists, and they take it to angels, and the angels look at it and go, I'm not investing in your company, but I have a patent. Yeah, but if you read your patent, you'll see the claims are very narrow. Well, nobody told me. Or worse yet, which you hinted at before the From the Hill update, you have the patent, but then guess what? The big bullies start stepping on your toes, and you're too small to do anything about it. And that could be a real problem for smaller companies.
Oh, absolutely.
It's happening a little bit less than it did before for two reasons. Number one, the internet. Okay? companies don't want to be perceived
as
being bullies.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
They want to be perceived as partners to,
Right.
David and Goliath like partnerships. We're not beating up the little guy, we're partnering with the little guy. And I think some of those companies are very sincere about that, by the way. They're not just sort of making that up for public relations. They would love to have good strategic partnerships with smaller companies.
Well, it costs them less as opposed to innovating on their own internally with the R&D. Yeah.
A lot more accountability. They know that the power of some of the social networks that are out there will punish them for stepping on the little guy.
Yes.
The second reason is, up until recently, a lot of these small companies, if their intellectual property rights were stepped on, could not afford to take on the big company and in litigation, because it was the sport of kings. It was so expensive. But what's happened is some specialty finance companies have come up, not a lot of them yet, but a couple of smaller firms that will essentially do their due diligence and will provide some type of financing to the smaller company who wants to challenge the bigger company if the bigger company has stepped all over their patents. And that's a really interesting development, because now even the smaller company has a chance to, if they can't hold them accountable through the social networking, to hold the larger company accountable by hooking up with one of these specialty finance shops.
One thing I did want to mention, and we did, folks know this, but I'd like to bring it up again, is that you can email your questions in directly.
Absolutely. Some have just come in.
Ask and you shall receive. I get those, Andrew.
I know you do. I just was trying to take
but please, do send us your questions.
Because this is stuff the co-host sent the other way.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. This is getting back. Here's a good, actually, it's a very good question, and this comes from Don in Birmingham, Alabama. How much does an IP audit cost? Based on your past audit, what percentage of a small company's IP assets are know-how assets?
Wow. Thank you, Don, from Birmingham.
Don sounds like he knows what he's...
We have an Alabama rate today on IP audits,
That's
so
right.
we can discount that. Well, a couple things. First of all, the IP audit should be as broad or as complex as your inventory of intellectual property assets. If you've been accumulating assets and not knowing quite what to do with them, the audit could be relatively extensive. It's not like an accounting audit. It's actually fun. We did one recently in Indianapolis. We went out to the company for the day. We did a very high-level strategic audit. The cost wasn't very high. It was a day of my time and expenses. And actually, you mentioned Inc. 500. Inc. magazine came with us that day. They were intrigued after the speech in Savannah with the concept of the strategic intellectual property audit for smaller companies. And next month's issue, the May issue, will have an article about that day in Indianapolis. How did I interact with these companies? What did we do? I don't mean that in a self-promotional way, but you might want to take a look, Don, and other viewers that are interested in this topic at that article, because it walks you through the anatomy of an IP audit.
Oh, okay.
In kind of
and that'll be helpful
time.
for folks who have limited resources who may want to start the process on their own.
And so maybe it's as simple as a day with the right strategist who prepares. You and your team should take the time to figure out what assets you may have, because remember, this is an interactive process. You can't just come in with an audit checklist and say, do you have this, do you have this, do you have that? Part of what you and your team need to do to prepare is be thinking about what really gives us a strategic edge. So the second part of your question, Don, about know-how is critical, because that's really what know-how is. Know-how and show-how are subcategories of intellectual property that are the things, the guts that make you successful. And in some cases, that know-how is a lot more valuable than you may realize, and a lot bigger portion of your overall intellectual property portfolio than you may realize.
This comes from Susan in St. Paul, Minnesota, big innovative part of the country up there. Again, it goes back to costs and resources. How do you expect a small company to find the time, finances to do an IP audit? Even if we find hidden assets, we don't have the time, resources, bandwidth to pursue a patent, methodology, process, whatever, without upsetting cash flow from operations while we're bootstrapping. Help! Exclamation point. That comes from Susan in St. Paul. I mean, this is a difficult issue.
Yeah,
it's,
I know.
You're just...
But Susan, I want you to listen very, very carefully, okay? Because I get the sense from your question that you are either in or about to be in hamster on the wheel syndrome. and you have to get off the wheel at some point. Are you working in your business or on your business? I can't begin to tell you how many Susans I've worked with over the years who tell me they attend a speech or they watch a webcast like this and they go, wow, that was really exciting. Where do I find the time to do this? How do I take the time to do this? And I say, okay, so let me get this straight.